Hello, I'm Kate Price-McCarthy and welcome to this mini podcast episode, which features an interview with comedian, actor, Twitter star and author Emma Kennedy. Her latest novel, The Never-Ending Summer, is set in the early 1970s when best friends Agnes and Bea decide on one last adventure before their adult lives begin. And while the two friends head off to London, Agnes's mother, Florence, sets off to Europe on her own voyage of self-discovery. Emma talks about how her own teenage life provided some inspiration for the book, and about the impact of feminism on women's lives in the 1970s, particularly with Germaine Greer's groundbreaking book, The Female Eunuch. She also talks about the power of female friendship, and about how she made the shift from a career in law to comedy and writing. The interview starts with Emma reading a short extract from the start of the novel.
"Okay," Bea said, exhaling heavily. "Have you finished it?" Agnes reached into the blue canvas bag slung across her chest and pulled out a battered-looking book. It was The Female Eunuch. "I have." She handed it to Bea. "What did you think?" "It's the filthiest book I've ever read." Bea's face lit up. She was an odd-looking girl, one eye that veered in towards her nose, teeth that seemed as if they'd been thrown into her mouth, and a ruddy complexion that left her wind-blasted. She would have been perfect on a farm in the middle of nowhere, but here, on Christchurch Meadow, among the willowy rose and the beech trees, she was out of place, a mongrel among the thoroughbreds. "Filthier than Chatterley?" Bea narrowed her eyes. Agnes nodded. "So much filthier than Chatterley." Agnes stared down at the cover, the naked female torso hanging from a hook. Bea's hand was hovering over it, as if it might be a crystal ball. Her eyes were wide and staring. She looked delighted and astonished. "It's definitely the filthiest book I have ever read, absolutely definitely, and the most daring, and the most startling, and the most powerful. Did you like the bit about courage and independence?" Agnes nodded. "And the bit about security being the denial of life?" Agnes tilted her head. "I wasn't quite sure what that meant." Bea gripped Agnes by the shoulders. "It's about your mother. It's about my mother. It's about us. We have to throw it all off, Agnes. We have to wave goodbye to safety. We have to take the bull by the horns." "After our exams." Bea's hands fell from Agnes's shoulders. She gave a shrug. "Yes, after our exams." They both stood for a moment, minds racing at different speeds. "I liked the bit about personal responsibility." Agnes didn't want Bea to think she wasn't embracing these new ideas, but in truth, it scared her a little. It's hard to break away from the only things you've ever known. Bea gave a small nod, but didn't seem overly impressed. Agnes tried again. "I think it's entirely dangerous." "How'd you feel about that?" Bea winked. "Thrilled?" "Me too," Agnes smiled. She wasn't sure she meant it. Still, Bea would be happy. "I think I might be a bit in love with Germaine Greer. What do you think about that?" Bea's face shone with excitement. "Why wouldn't you be?" "We need to become second-wave feminists immediately. They seem to be able to do whatever they want. I can't quite get over it." She shook her head. "Shall I give a copy to my mother?" Agnes sounded playful, as if the thought was outrageous. Bea stopped, her mouth slightly open. "I'm not sure she's ready for it, are you? Women putting themselves first?" Agnes laughed. "Her brain would explode." She paused. "Maybe she needs her brain to explode. Maybe everyone needs their brains to explode." Agnes looked back towards the rowers. "After we finished our exams." "Yes," nodded Bea. "After we finished our exams." "Agnes," she said, gripping her friend's arm, "there's a revolution going on right now out there." She turned and pointed off towards the distance. "And we need to be a part of it." "Yes, we do." "I have given this some thought," said Bea, her face settling into seriousness. "And I think the first thing we need to do after we've finished our exams is lose our virginity. I can think of nothing more important. We cannot be full-blown second-wave feminists until we have had sex.
Thank you so much for that. It was really hard not to laugh as you were reading it out. So thank you so much for coming to talk to us about your latest book, The Never-Ending Summer, which was an absolute joy to read.
Oh, thank you.
It's about two generations of women, Agnes Ledbury and her best friend Bea, who are just about to finish Secretarial College in Oxford. And it's also about Agnes's mother, Florence, who up until this time has led a very conventional married life. So could you tell us a bit about how their different stories develop from there?
Yes, it's set in 1971, and as the bit I've just read out makes clear, The Female Eunuch has been published. And we forget now, sort of, it was like throwing a hand grenade into society, that book. And it had different impacts on different generations of women. So for young women like Agnes, who at this point in the story is 18/19, she's suddenly realizing that women can be sexually liberated, and that in and of itself was an enormous step forward. Women were encouraged to enjoy sex, to take control of their own bodies, and all of that. But for women of Florence's generation, who is Agnes's mother, who would have been a typical 1950s housewife, for them it was like a little bit more serious and upsetting, because what the book was basically telling them was that they were unpaid slaves and that their life was pointless. And I think that's what I wanted to explore, somebody who has just accepted her lot in life and is just a housewife, and who suddenly thinks there's more to life than this, surely. Because remember, at that time, they when people got married, the woman would be handed this little red book, and it was a prescribed daily diary of what you had to do on any given day as a housewife. And it was incredibly prescriptive, and people stuck to it.
I love the scene at the Tupperware party where Florence asks her married friends whether they are happy to be housewives, and the floodgates open. I found that scene very moving.
Yes. Well, it's quite interesting. I did a lot of research for the book, and it was around this time as well that the very first women's lib meetings started to happen. And what's fascinating is that the word sexism didn't exist. They didn't know how to describe what their experience was at the hands of men or at the hands of society at that time. And that sort of seems extraordinary now, given that that's only 40, 50 years ago, but they didn't know how to explain sexism. But they knew that they felt it, they knew that they experienced it, but they didn't have the language to explain it.
It is a fascinating time for women's lives, and I can see that you had done lots of research to really get under its skin. Maybe could you talk about some of the books that I know you found particularly helpful?
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, I think if anyone wants to do any in-depth reading about this period, then I really can't recommend enough Virginia Nicholson's books. There are two. I'm just looking at them down on my shelves now. There's one, How Was It For You? And she's written another great one called Perfect Wives. But both of those books are absolutely sort of invaluable if you're trying to get to the bottom of what women's experiences were during the 50s and 60s and 70s. And then I read Rosie Boycott's book, her autobiography. That there was loads of things, and lots of spare rib magazines. I spent hours pouring through, mostly because I wanted to find some actual demos that they could have gone on. So the chapter where they go and are slapping stickers on breasts in the London Underground, that was something that actually happened.
I'll make sure that we've got links to some of the books you've mentioned, because I'm sure they'll all be available in our libraries.
There's a bibliography at the back of the book.
Obviously, this is a dominant theme within the book, but it is also the story of Agnes and this dreadful disappointment she's living with at the time. Now, it's far from autobiographical, partly because of the time in which it's set. But I know your life does overlap with Agnes's a bit, in that you too, like Agnes, had your A levels kiboshed by illness. Perhaps could you tell us a bit more about that, and also about whether you had a B? Did you have a B friendship in your life to help you get through it?
Well, yes and yes. I went to, as was very much de rigueur in the mid-80s. There was only one thing to do if you were a child of my age, and that was on a Friday or a Saturday. There would always be a village disco, and I went to one and I snogged a boy. And I can't even remember his name, but he was sort of like the equivalent of a Death Eater in Harry Potter, because he gave me glandular fever. And some people aren't that unwell with glandular fever. You can have like a week off school or whatever. But I was desperately, desperately ill, and I wasn't properly well for a year. And the upshot of it was that I missed out on my grades. I'd been given an offer to go to Oxford, and I didn't get the grades, and that was the end of that. And instead of going into clearing, it was like something inside me had died, because I had given myself one goal in life, and it was to get to Oxford. And I don't know where that had come from, because nobody in my family had even been to university, let alone Oxford. I was just fixated on it. And instead of going to university, I went to work in a hotel as a washer-upper. And I was promoted to vegetable peeler, and I thought, I'm doing well here. I'm earning a bit of money. I can afford to buy skirts from Gap, and I just gave up on all thoughts of not just going to Oxford, of going to any university at all. And then I had a very chance encounter with an old English teacher called Mrs. Graby. And she had retired, so she didn't know what had happened to me. And she came, and it was about early September. She said, "Oh, you must be off to university." And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm working up at the hotel." And she looked at me with, and it's sometimes in your life people give you a look that it of utter incredulity. And it was one of those looks, and she just stared at me and she said, "Emma, you were the best English student I ever had. The thought of you not going to university is ridiculous." And then she said the one sentence that changed my life forever, and I will credit her for this until the day I die. She said, "Anybody can give up, Emma. It's the easiest thing in the world. Never give up." And then she gave me her phone number, and she said, "If you change your mind, you come and see me." And I went home, and I felt properly ashamed that I had given myself a goal in life and I had let it go. And with the help of a girl who was in the year above, who was writing me letters saying, you mustn't give up, you mustn't give up, you mustn't give up. So she was my B. And my mother as well sort of stepped up to the plate and said, "Come on, you can do this." And so I started going to see Mrs. Graby, and she would make me cups of tea and give me slices of cake, and we would talk about books and poems and plays. And she packed me back off up to Oxford, and I got in.
Part of this story is a summer road trip around Europe.
Yes.
And reading this in the midst of lockdown genuinely felt a bit like going on a real holiday, or at least as close to a holiday as we can get at the moment. I mean, the sun and the food, mouth was watering. Did you write this during lockdown? And if so, was it a real escape for you as well?
No, I didn't. No. This was actually written a while back. The publication date was pushed to this year. It was supposed to come out last August, but we moved it because of pandemic and all sorts. So no, I actually wrote it I finished it and handed it in, I think, just before lockdown started. But I love writing about being on holiday, as you probably know. But it was a joy to finally write about holidays that were nice and where nothing disastrous happened.
And another part of the story is about what Agnes and Bea get up to in London, because they end up having all kinds of adventures, mainly through their work for this rather extraordinary job agency run by Mr. Adler and his agency
Mr. Adler.
His agency for go-getting ladies. Love that.
Yes.
So was there a real inspiration behind this agency? Please tell me that there was.
Yes, there was. Yes. There used to be very dodgy employment agencies. My wife's mother was a temp during this time, and I sat down with her, and she was telling me all the dodgy, weird jobs that she would be sent to go to. So that was something that happened. But I also, again, I did during the course of my research, and again, I list them all in the back of the book so that you can go and look them up and watch them for yourself. The public information film that they end up having to be extras on, that public information film does exist. It's about a purse pincher. That does exist. And there were two girls that are standing at the till, and I just suddenly, something just struck me. I thought, oh, wouldn't it be lovely if that was Agnes and Bea? So that's why they ended up being in the public information film.
Now, through Agnes and Bea's adventures and scrapes, and through the relationships we see them develop with their Hampstead housemates, we start to see the kind of tension that perhaps builds up between really close friends who are beginning to have outside pressures and influences on their relationship for the first time. Is that a kind of theme you were keen to explore?
Yes, very much so, because I'm fascinated by that sort of last really lovely, beautiful, platonic love affair that you have with a friend, could be a man or a woman, before you sort of start your adult life proper. And I mean, I certainly had one. But at some point there has to be the wrenching apart, because you can't stay together forever. And you do have to go your separate ways. So it's a subject I've written about before. It's very much part of I Left My Tent in San Francisco. That was my Bea, and that's what that book is really about. That book is really about the end of that amazing last love affair you have, that's platonic, that's entirely platonic, before you start the rest of your life.
But very intense.
Yeah, very intense. Yeah. It's well, I think most people have experienced this. It's sort of like you're in a relationship, but you're not, but you are, if you get what I mean. It's just, it's not sexual.
Yeah, it's kind of almost like a practice.
It's really, I think women especially are capable of really intense platonic friendships, and they've got nothing to do with sex, but it is about love.
Now, this isn't the first book you've written about the Ledbury family, because your first adult novel, The Things We Left Unsaid, that was focused on Agnes's older sister and niece. Was there something that drew you back to writing more about Agnes's youth?
Yes, it was. The feedback from Things We Left Unsaid was that everybody loved Agnes, and she was clearly sort of a favourite character from that novel. And that's what, and we didn't see much of Florence in Things We Left Unsaid. We see her very, very briefly. And I knew that I wanted to have a book set in 1971 and explore the impact that Female Eunuch had. And it just suddenly struck me, given that I had so enjoyed writing about that family, that I would stay within that family, because obviously Agnes is just a side player in Things We Left Unsaid. But I wanted to give her own book. So it was like the marriage of two worlds coming together.
Now, I understand that although you initially got sidetracked into first working as a solicitor and then as obviously as a comedy performer and actress, it was always your ambition to become a writer. Tell me, how did you segue from the law into comedy?
Yeah, so I was sitting on the tube one morning. It was about 6:00. And I had a great big box full of documents, and I just looked down the carriage, and everybody else sitting on the tube also had the big boxy documents that you have when you're a lawyer. And everyone looked grey and ill. And I just suddenly thought, oh my God, this is the next 40 years of my life. I'm not sure I can do this. And I got off the tube and I walked to my office, and then I went to my senior partner's office, who was a wonderful man. And I said, I've got terrible news, I'm leaving. And he thought I'd been headhunted. And I said, no, I am leaving to become a writer. And bear in mind, I'd written nothing at this point. Absolutely nothing. I had no job to go to, nothing. It was that thing of, I think if you're creative, you have a what if that's hanging over you all the time. It's like an itch you can't get rid of. And for me, the what if itch was too much to bear any longer, and I knew that I had to go away, and I had to see where it would take me, or I was going to go mad. And so that's what I did. And I mean, it was of the greatest irony, of course, that for the first 10 years I didn't do any writing at all, because I was sidetracked in front of a camera. And in radio, and I did radio and TV and presenting and acting, which I hadn't actually intended to do. It had happened by accident, and it was after I'd done The Smoking Room, I think, and I just said, look, come on, the reason you stopped being a lawyer was because you wanted to be a proper writer, and so that's when I started writing the books.
And how does the writing compare with more collaborative work you've done as a comedy writer and performer? It's a very much of an on your own job compared to what you had previously been doing.
It is much easier when you're working with other people, because you don't have to, it's not quite as hard. That's the point. I mean, I still do a lot of collaborative work, because I'm the other thing I do is I'm a screenwriter for children's animation series, and there is nothing greater, and you will have no better day than around a table with a load of children's animation writers, because that is the best fun you can have. But writing novels is a very long, hard, lonely process, and I'm a bit weird. I actually look forward to the editor's notes. I really enjoy doing second drafts of novels as opposed to first drafts. First drafts for me, I just get it down and get it done. Second draft is when the book happens for me.
This is a question I'm going to ask, which I try to remember to ask all the authors we interview, which is, do you have a memory of using libraries as a child, or indeed you still use them today? It's always lovely to hear when libraries have had a positive effect on people's lives. But of course, I'm quite prepared to hear you say you've never been in one in your life, or that you've always hated them. But if you do have any feelings about libraries.
I love libraries. I absolutely adore libraries. I was mad for my school library, weirdly, because it had these lovely little cubby holes. And to me, there is nothing more wonderful than the smell of books and being in a little sort of a little cubby hole, being able to read a book. Certainly when I was at Oxford, I would spend all day, every day, just skipping between the Bodleian and the Radcliffe Canberra, just being astonished at these beautiful, beautiful, beautiful libraries. I think it's one of my happiest memories from being at Oxford was just the quality of the libraries. It was just breathtaking. They were amazing places. I love libraries.
Actually, as there's been such a gap since you finished this one, presumably you've got a new novel ready and waiting to go, or if not.
Well, I'm currently writing a non-fiction book that will be out next year, and I'm almost at the end of the first draft of it now. But it's called Letters from Brenda. And when my mother died, I was left with very complicated feelings about her, because she'd had an undiagnosed mental illness for all of her life. And 3 years after she died, my father finally sold the family house, and the new owners got in contact with me because they had found 2 suitcases full of letters from her to me. And the book is about that.
So were these letters that she had sent or didn't send? Or
yes, and they'd obviously gone back home, obviously when I'd moved house or something, but I had forgotten about them. And it's 79 letters from her to me. But the book is about me. It's me following her from birth to death, and just exploring her life and what all of the big moments that turned her into the person she was, and trying to get to the bottom of whether she did have a mental illness or whether she was the sum total of the things that had happened to her. But it's going to be quite the read, I can tell you.